morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be sitting amongst three great individuals that are going to speak on issues pertaining to Africa in relation to post-election, when multi-party system became the thing. And I have Honorable Halifa Sallah from the Gambia, who has been, in recent times, experienced a classic case of what multi-party system in African politics, what conclusions or what extrapolations we can make out of that. So he's going to speak on Gambia as a case study in recent times, and how post-election crisis became an issue and how it was addressed. Halifa is an opposition party leader in the Gambia, a party that pretty much everybody knows about. DOI. It's a party that has existed in the 70s. It's been there for a very long time. So anyway, Mr. Sallah is in a better position to explain what mechanisms were put in place to make sure that there's not a total chaos in the Gambia in recent times, when an ousted president who lost the election decided to wanted to recontest the elections and stuff like that. So Mr. Sallah, I think, is in a better position to give us all the steps, the strategies, what negotiations transpired and stuff like that. So he's going to speak on that. And we have in the middle Tuna Sommerfeld from University of Natural Science in Norway here, who is an anthropologist who has had long experience in Africa, has lived in Gambia for many years, speaks many of our local languages, in fact better than, well, at least you speak one that I don't speak, which is a shame, but so she's pretty much familiar with the Gambia and Africa per se. So she's going to speak on ethnicity, if I'm right, and how that affects the core theme. So then we have a gentleman who it's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Jallow. I've followed you on YouTube. I must say I'm proud to call myself a Gambian and to be sitting with you. The stuff that you're doing in Malmo, it's very impressive. Keep it up. Mr. Jallow will also be debating these two, taking up, in other words, he'll be chiming in and giving his take on things. He's a member of parliament in Malmo, right?
Sweden.
Yeah, okay, in Sweden. Okay, all righty. Yeah, without further ado, I think the floor is Mr. Sallah. Mr. Salah's, I guess, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, the fellow discussants and the audience. This is one of the most significant topics that could be discussed in a globalization conference. The subject of my exposition is electoral crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, lessons from the Gambia. The key words: sub-Saharan Africa, electoral crisis, and lessons. What is the connection between sub-Saharan Africa, electoral crisis, and the Gambia? Is it that electoral crisis permeate mainly sub-Saharan Africa? Is there something unique about sub-Saharan Africa? Is there something unique about the Gambia to warrant this discourse in a globalization conference. My task is to problematize the issue of electoral crisis and do some postulations before giving you a hypothesis and then proceed to contextualize the issue of electoral crisis in sub-Saharan Africa and give you recommendations. The first postulation is, wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. And where there is resilience in resistance, there will be change. And the change depends on the context of the resistance and the oppression. Number two, it is important for us to see how oppression is contextualized. And oppression can be categorized into four forms. There could be oppression from the state, where the state is transformed into an instrument of coercion in the hands of the oppressor. Power to oppress could emerge from wealth, where wealth will control those who govern and direct them to oppress those who exploit it. The power to oppress could also emerge from the mob, where the state disintegrates and the mob will transform itself into militias, and the survival of the fittest comes, where the mob with the strongest power will impose its will on the weaker aspect. And then power to oppress could come from beliefs, where those who put themselves in the posture of a deity, worshipped by a people, could actually be controlled and directed against other consequences, and therefore will also transform themselves into an instrument of coercion against those who do not believe as they are, in order to make them to subdue, to believe, or be exterminated. So essentially, wherever we see conflict, we can categorize them into these four contextual frameworks. Now, the issue of sub-Saharan Africa, therefore, comes in by way of a hypothesis. First and foremost, I would like to emphasize that the issue of electoral conflict is not an end in itself. It has causes. And the cause is not simply one of the issues that people often mention, that a democratization process took place on the African continent and multi-party systems emerge, and as a result, this creates this post-electoral conflicts. I would like to emphasize the real cause of electoral conflict. And this we cannot fully comprehend until we understand the trajectory of Africa's political evolution. I would like to make three fundamental submissions. Number one, that Africa had and still has to go through three processes of political evolution. And without completing these processes, then crisis cannot be averted. The first was the process of decolonization, thus ensuring that the continent attained the right to self-determination and independence. Number two is the guarantee of the sovereignty of statehood and the sovereignty of citizens. And number three is the institutionalization of the sovereignty of statehood and the sovereignty of citizens through the acculturation process, where citizens actually rule and those who lead are led by them to serve them, where citizens take control of power as citizens and not as people belonging to ethnic groups, religious groups, gender issues, or even regional issues. That citizens are citizens, sovereign and equal in sovereignty, irrespective of their diversity. Herein lies the cornerstone of a country and a continent that would be at peace with itself, stable, and without the type of conflict that we see today. Now, the issue of sub-Saharan Africa, first of all, must be deconstructed. And we have to reconstruct the very subject that is before us, because there is no sub-Saharan Africa. It does not exist as an entity. There are economic groupings in Africa, ECOWAS, etc., but you do not have sub-Saharan Africa. That's a creation of people who want to conceive Africa in that way. There is, of course, an Africa with an African Union, and which has divided itself into those 5 groupings: North, South, East, West, and Central. And we must understand the evolution of that continent and the evolution of the electoral process. Nkrumah has said, when he became the president of Ghana in 1957, that looking at the history, as far as he was concerned, before 1957, there was no strategy for decolonization. And when that is continental strategy, and when Ghana became independent in 1957, they decided to evolve a continental strategy to attain the first stage of the democratization process. That is the stage of decolonization and the struggle for the right to self-determination and independence. In doing so, they had to have meetings involving the then independent African states, and those states went across the borders up to the north. And those states agreed to come together in order to support the independent movements that emerged on the continent during that period. So they had a meeting in Ghana, and ultimately a meeting of all the freedom fighters in December, so that they can bring them together, give them resources in order for them to go back to their countries in order to struggle for the independence of their countries. But then the agenda was continental unity, that they were freeing those countries so that they could unite and become one. That is why when Congo became independent, that is now DRC, and Ghana, on the 8th of August 1960, Lumumba and Nkrumah agreed to establish a Union of African States to start the process of unification of the continent, because they realized that unless they were able to produce their raw materials, unless they were able to process the raw materials, unless they were able to build the machines that do the processing, then you cannot have an independent economy. And they felt that colonialism did not create that reality, so they had to invent it by unity and using the resources to build the banking systems, to build the investment structures, to build the companies necessary in order to facilitate this independent development of the continent. But all of you know the history, and of course, moderator I'm giving 35 minutes.
20.
Now I have?
Now you get about 10.
10 years. So guide me, otherwise I will be speaking out of context. Okay. So we through your questions, we'll come to that. But essentially, what has happened is a failure of unification of the continent, and ultimately microstates developed, and ultimately we've seen what happened, that these microstates could not be independent. These microstates were built on people who belong to different ethnic groups, different religions, just carved as the colonial past eventually became microstates, independent African states. And ultimately, we began the process of the state being transformed into an instrument of coercion to maintain the powers of leaders who enrich themselves because they occupy state power. So consequently, the military saw that it was out of their power that these leaders could maintain power and enrich themselves. So why don't they also just take over the power? So the era of coup d'etats emerged. That is why between 1965 up to 1989, you can see that all the West African states, except two, Senegal, Cape Verde, fell under military control, military regime. 1990s also, the ethnic groups began to fight for control, because when you ethnicize the state power, the power of the mob will come, militias develop, so consequently they had to also combat that. With the Liberian crisis, eventually Sierra Leone, we saw what happened. So we entered a period of real resurgence of the mob power, and the state lose total control in many of the countries, and consequently we had to move again to the next phase, which was the democratization process, moving towards the sovereignty of the state and also the sovereignty of the people. Republics emerge. And to cut matters short, today in West Africa, you will not find a single monarchy. All the countries are republics, but the final stage where Gambia became important in this context is the stage of the people being sovereign, because sovereignty of the people means that power must emanate from them. It means that they must elect the leaders. Now, that is the second phase that we are in. That is the stage West Africa is in, many African countries. We need to move to the third stage. And in Gambia, because we are in that second stage, where still those who control state power use it as instrument of coercion in order to maintain themselves, impunity prevails. Consequently, by 2015, 20th July, Gambia was heading towards civil war, because the power that be decided to come up with a reform of the election laws to make it more difficult for political parties to exist. That you had to pay 1 million to even establish a political party. Conditions were imposed on those political parties that they could not fulfill. So it was in December that the political parties told the IEC that the conditions imposed on them could not be addressed, and then it watered down the electoral reform process that existed, which was making it worse for the parties. And by April, we could sense, April 2016, we could sense that a crisis was imminent, because that power, that be intended to stay, and had prepared all the ground to stay. It had built the instrument of coercion, strengthened the paramilitary forces with tear gas canisters, everything instrument of suppression, waiting for people to rise up. Now, it was at that moment that eventually crisis emerged, where one person led a group of people to demonstrate, less than 100 people, who cannot overthrow a state, whom one could even tolerate and then leave to go, but they were arrested, and eventually one of them was killed. And the leader, the person came from the leader of a party that had majority as far as the opposition is concerned. And that leader also went into the street, arrest and detention. That leader had reached 65 years, because the rule was there that you cannot stand for presidential election if you are above 65. So in essence, that was no longer possible. So in short, that led to hopelessness, and people really believe that Gambia could not be changed to the ballot box. This is why we started the process relying on the importance of strategy, the importance of tactics, that the strategy that should be employed is to forget about partisan differences, forget about ethnicity, unite as a nation, and try to work on a strategy of putting somebody in office who will be a symbolic president, and through that, we create the basis for everybody to unite to start the process of nation building. So the agenda that gave rise to the coalition in the Gambia and its success was based on this fundamental fact that by agreeing to restart nationhood and citizenship, we'll be able to galvanize the people to be able to effect change, where a regime will be removed, a people will take over power, and then we will have a reform process of building the instruments, institutions of the state, and involve the people in that process. Constitutional reform, institutional reform, and other reform processes, so that the normative practices of civil servants, of the army, of all institutions will begin to evolve towards the third phase. That was the agenda, and that's why it was possible to maintain the people, to effect the change and maintain the people, even though there was resistance to the change, until we have a new government. So my conclusion, therefore, is telling me, and through your questions will come, is that yes, the change has occurred, but then the objectives of the constitutional reform, institutional reform is ongoing, and the climate that should have facilitated the attainment of the sovereignty of the people, and start from there to build an electoral system where the people will determine their manner of government. Of course, that has been lost. The momentum has been lost because the power that be appears not to be symbolic. It appears to be evolving to be the executive presidency, and of course, it goes with all the uncertainties, of people not knowing where they are going. So, in short, my conclusion is that yes, we have attained our fundamental objective of regime change, but yet we have not attained the fundamental objective of system change. But the system change was not meant to be effected by this government. It was meant to be a transitional administration, symbolic, and we build the institutions, and then the system change will be effected by the next following government, which would have been elected democratically under a system where the sovereignty of the people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salah. I believe this promises to be quite a very interesting day. Mr. Salah has pretty much given us a historical context of what went down in Africa. I mean, he has given us the whole enchilada. So, I mean, this is going to be, I see Mr. Jallo here, he's like literally whetting his appetite to fire up some questions. So this promises to be fun. Next is none other than our friend who has been very instrumental in Gambian affairs, has contributed, has given advice, has been to, in all the meetings when we had the crisis situation with dictatorship and all of that. She was part and parcel of those who were supporting us and making sure that our voice is heard out there. She's an anthropologist at Norwegian University of Science, right?
Yes.
Right, and she has spent so many years, as I mentioned earlier, in the Gambia, has a lot of experience about the Gambia and our core African politics. On that note, the floor is yours. I understand it's 15 minutes, give and take 15,
yes, I'll try.
Minutes.
I'll give it a go.
15, 20 minutes for you too. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me properly? Yeah? Well, first of all, thank you very much for including me in this panel. I mean, for those of you who do not and have not followed Gambian politics very closely and do not know Halifa Sallah, as some of you may know, Halifa Sallah has been involved in Gambian politics over, well, nearly 5 decades or more. So it's a panel of celebrities here, and it's a pleasure to get to know you as well. And as you said, I'm neither a parliamentarian nor a politician, but an anthropologist working in Trondheim, University of Trondheim. Yes, I conducted fieldwork in the Gambia, in Farafenye, in the Badibus, in 1995 to 1996, and I was in Ndungu Kebe in the Nyomis in 2003, and I also worked in Banjul as a voluntary teacher in 1992. So I was there both before and after the coup of Yahya Jammeh, also during the previous president Jawara. But with reference to the overall title or topic given to this panel, it should be emphasized, as Khalifa Saleh just said, to those not familiar with the Gambia, that the Gambia is an example of a state that gradually lost its democracy, in a way, after 1994. There were imperfections also in the democracy, obviously, before then, but it became quite dramatic after 1994, when Yahya Jammeh came to power in a military coup. But rather than focusing on the superficial way in which elections worked during the former regime, I've been asked to comment on the potential for conflict at present, following the regime change in 2017. To the coalition government of the current president, Adama Barrow. And more specifically, I've been asked to provide comments on the apparent upsurge in ethnicity-related rhetoric in Gambian politics following the political transition, and the so-called tribal and tribalist dimension in political tensions in the Gambia. And the background for my comments is research that I'm conducting with a fellow anthropologist who's called Niklas Hultin, who's at the University of George Mason in the United States, and I'm also relying on new document research and previous fieldworks. So just a few words first for those unfamiliar with the context, a few words about the Gambian context. After the 2016 presidential election and the ensuing standoff that led to the ECOWAS military intervention, President Yahya Jammeh stepping down, ethnic politics seem to have become a dominant theme in the political landscape. Gambian media and social media in the country and in the diaspora see very frequent allegations of tribalism, with authors expressing alarm. And I've heard people in Norway saying, Gambians in Norway, saying that they're worried that the Gambias develop into sort of an ethnic conflict zone. A few examples of how this appears. Following the parliamentary elections in 2017, for instance, the European Union Election Observation Commission, that were to oversee that the election was free and fair, they noted in their final report, and I'm going to quote that report so that you get an idea of the sort of official reading of the election. One sentence states, "During the final days of the campaign, the subject of political tribalism became more prominent in the Gambian narrative. The EU Electoral Observation Mission observed rallies where ethnicity was exploited to mobilize political support. These included United Democratic Party, UDP, the largest opposition or the largest party now, the largest party in parliament. Appealed for support of the Mandinka and Manjago communities in Kanifing, in West Coast region, and in Lower River region. And the EU mission also observed efforts by the Gambia Democratic Congress, which is another political party, GDC, to call for the votes of the Fula community in the Lower River region." End of quote. Okay? And the alleged ethnic or tribal base of the Gambia's largest political party, UDP, is a very much debated issue in both media and social media. And some groups of followers are regularly accused of trying to promote Mandinko privilege, and the Mandinko UDP link is running high in many debates, especially related to youth groups. And conversely, during the regime of the former President Jammeh, himself an ethnic Jola, it was often held that privilege followed ethnic lines. I'm not entirely certain that I agree to that general statement, but that's another matter. At present, and quite erroneously, I would say, ethnic identity as Jola is often confused with loyalty to the APRC, which was the party of the former President Jammeh. And for those familiar with Gambian politics and society, please excuse my basic level of information, okay? Some other brief examples. In April 2017, the Freedom newspaper ran an article or an opinion piece written by an anonymous soldier of the Gambian army that accused the chief of defense staff of Mandingoization of the security services. And in May, the same newspaper ran a story of a man from Sokoto accusing immigration agents of anti-Fulla discrimination. But both of these stories came out of a newspaper that regularly prints stories by an author who himself limits his critique to UDP and to Mandinko, and by many are considered peddling anti-Mandinko sentiments. Importantly, regardless of sort of personal understandings of these events and how they unfolded, it's a fact that a language of ethnicity or tribe appears and reappears time and again. And another event with a very tragic outcome that I know also that Honorable Ali Fasalla has commented on earlier. In June 2017, there was a shooting incident at the former president's home village of Kanilai, and this incident had profound ethnic undertones. Protesters demonstrated against what they saw singling out of this Pony area and against the way that the ECOWAS or ECOMIG forces related to the local population, especially regarding how cattle that entered the ECOMIG camps were held back and then people coming to reclaim them were arrested and so on. So there were a lot of sort of conflicts over the daily relationships between the ECOMIG presence and the local community. And earlier this year, the Gambia saw, to my knowledge, and I may be wrong, but the first arrest made for hate speech in the Gambia. This time against, or hate speech against Mandinko. If you look at this and all of these events very superficially, they may seem to follow a well-known pattern. Political scientists and other scholars have discussed many times how authoritarian rule can be linked to sort of ethnic conflict. From this point of view, events in the Gambia follow a very familiar script where an authoritarian leader of a multi-ethnic society falls down, and as a result, latent ethnic conflict sort of bubble to the surface. Neither I nor my colleague Niklas Hultin believe that the Gambia fits this model. Okay? Instead, many of these narratives indicate that the recurrent referencing of tribe or ethnicity is best understood as a way of questioning political legitimacy and moral stamina of people holding power or claiming power. And it's brought forth in the language practice to disqualify political critique and opposition during the later phase of Jammeh's rule. So I want to say just a few words about ethnicity in the Gambia, which is very important, because ethnic identification can be seen in Gambia daily life almost every day. It's related to language, to cultural customs, and to notions of common origin. To a certain extent, it's also related to economy and to subsistence, so that some ethnic categories are known for particular crafts. Or, for instance, you will see that Jolas dominate oyster harvesting, or that Fulanis are specialists in cattle herding, and so on. But in general terms, ethnicity or tribe does not regulate the access to resources in the Gambia. And they do not constitute different hierarchically organized classes, as it did, for instance, in Rwanda. Okay? So family ties can certainly regulate access to resources, but that's a different matter. And several social entities that are referred to by Gambians today as tribes result from colonial assignments of tribal or ethnic constructs, and also from mutations and consolidations of identities that preceded colonial rule. But the point is, these are quite flexible categories in daily life. And this means, for instance, that ethnicity can shape the way that people relate to each other, but in a manner that seldom provides social barriers. So, for instance, you will see this in standardized joking relationships when people have kal relationships. You'll see it in surname equivalence across ethnic boundaries, so that surnames that are associated with different ethnic groups, say Juwaran, Bo, Wilanam, Fafana, Tunkara, and Kante, Nyang, and Sanyang, and so on, are seen as the same. Okay, so you have these integrated mechanisms across ethnic boundaries. And you can see it in the fact that people freely marry across ethnic boundaries. So it's more the rule than an exception that you have a mother and a father of different ethnicities. And you see it in family histories, because people travel, and family histories acknowledge that people change their tongue and also their customs when they move to new places. And this is recognized. And even though this mutability and flexibility of ethnicity is not the case for all, I mean, some people claim to be pure, something or other, it is still a fact that ethnicity in the Gambia, I would say, doesn't really constitute groups, but they constitute networks or categories, and they are relevant in interpersonal relationships, but not as mobilizing resources, okay? That does not mean that ethnicity cannot be mobilized for political purposes, and that's partly what we're seeing now. This is not the first time, though, that ethnicity is appearing or coming to the surface. We saw this also in the run-up to independence, when you had quite significant anti-Mandinka rhetoric, for instance, by the UP leader Saranjai, yes, who made some very famous comments that were cited in a book. And another example, also later during Jawara, you had a griot, an oral historian whom I met in 1996, Bella Dieng, who was in fact sacked from Radio Gambia after making some very odd comments, but it was, you know, derogatory comments about an ethnic group. And that was under the previous, or the government of Dawda Jawara, the first independent president that sat in office, remained in office till the coup in 1994. And I just want to make a few comments about the Jawara phase, because Jawara made a very conscious effort to suppress not only anti-Mandinko sentiments, but most of all Mandinka ethnic rhetoric in his own party. And he did so partly to create political relations and loyalties across this division that the colonial power had created between the rural protectorate and the urban colony. And Jawara underplayed ethnicity at the dismay of some of his PPP party members, who eventually broke out into the National Convention Party, NCP. And in political competition in this period, the PPP accused the NCP of being tribal, that is, of not having the nation's interests at heart. So again, criticism of tribalism is equivalent with criticism of narrow-mindedness. And under Jammeh, the previous president, identity issues were made relevant in politics in ways that had not seen before. It was made acute. Following a speech in June 2016, for instance, Yahya Jammeh earned the condemnation of the UN Special Advisor on the prevention of genocide for his threat against Mandinko. It's really ironic, actually, that Jammeh, who was known to be such a sort of known for an anti-Western rhetoric, recreated identity politics in the language of colonial divisions.
I think that's a brilliant juncture where we can. But you can go ahead and do your last. Yeah.
I will just make my final argument. The point is, because that brings me to my take on today, that with the exception of some extremist youth, today's tribal flair, I will say, is not about interpersonal aggression. I will say that it's the language to express dismay at power and suspicion of power and those who claim power for channeling resources to those closest to them. It's a language to bring political contestation into the public arena. It's a sort of a way to discuss politics. That does not mean that it's fortunate, but it means that we must focus on what is behind and under these languages of ethnicity. I think I'll just stop there and we can leave the rest for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tuna.
Excellent.
What a brilliant analysis of tribes in Africa when it works. And usually, historically, it really works. It's a beautiful thing, you know, that we can, like you mentioned, Cal, like we can relate through different ways, because each tribe has its own beauties to sell to the other, and it's beautiful. That it is so sad that politicians, it seems, have been using tribe as an instrument for political machinations or whatever, to push an agenda. And it seems like in the Gambia in recent times we've had quite a scary something that's completely unknown in Gambia, because these tribes have existed and we've never had issues with that. But I mean, recent times it has been very rife, especially on social media, with all the bad language and the smearing and it's been very, but we know amongst ourselves that it's not as much. And I share your sentiment about the tribe issue, that if it's looked from a purely refined perspective, it is a brilliant thing when it really works, So yeah, I'm sure Mr. Jallo has a lot of things to add on to these two beautiful introductions. So the floor is yours, Mr. Jallo. You can bounce off whoever you want to pick your target.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I want to use this opportunity to thank the organizers for having us here today to talk about such an interesting and important issue. As mentioned by the moderator, I live in Sweden, and I work in Sweden as a member of parliament, but I was born and raised in the Gambia. I was born and raised in the Gambia, and in fact, I was in the Gambia when the former president took over power. So I spent most of my life in Sweden, but I have spent a good part of my life in the Gambia, growing up and understanding how the democratic dispensation looked like then and now. I've been following it up until today. Talking about sub-Saharan Africa and post-electoral crisis, it's a very important issue, but we cannot isolate the Gambia from the rest of Africa. As much as I am one of those that quite often hear politicians and policymakers talk about Africa as if it's one country, and I always challenge that notion and question it. But today I would like to talk about Africa as a continent, not excluding Gambia as an exception, because some of the things that we see in Gambia, we see in most part of Africa. We cannot talk about the democratic dispensation and post-electoral conflicts without talking about leadership, for example. Leadership is a very important and crucial role, plays a very important and crucial role in creating a democratic dispensation. And one of the things that Africa has been criticized for is bad leadership. There is no political hygiene when it comes to the leadership of Africa. We have a lot of people who take the role of leadership who have the only interest of benefiting themselves and enriching themselves rather than benefiting the people. But as we see a lot of people criticize leadership in Africa, one thing that we normally forget, or at least actively avoid to mention, is our roles. What role do we have, especially those of us in the West, in creating the democratic dispensation and the post-electoral conflicts that we see in Africa today? We are very quick to point a finger and say things are not working in Africa because the people in Africa are incapable, the leaders of Africa are incapable of trying to lead the Africans, trying to make sure that the resources and the potential that we have would be translated into something that will benefit the African population. We're very, very quick to do that, especially in the West. But one thing we always forget is that the West has also been a part of the architecture that we see today. And this is historically, but also contemporary. From the transatlantic slave trade, where people were enslaved and used as tools to enrich the West, the capitalist, I remember in Sweden, I don't know if those of you that are from Norway here, you know Sweden used to be part of the transatlantic slave trade, but that's not even within our history books. You don't teach that. And when the slave trade was supposed to end in Sweden, what they did was the owners of the slaves said we need to compensate, the government need to compensate the enslavers. So taxpayers' money was used to enslave, to enrich the enslavers, whilst the victims of slavery were left to perish. The same thing happened in the whole of Africa. From that, we went to colonization, where, you know, Africa is rich, but Africans are poor. We have colonizers that would come and they would rob and they would take everything of value. From the language to the culture to the tradition to the minerals, everything of value. Take it away and bring it to the West to enrich the West and make it what it is today. But yet today we can point a finger to the leaders and Africans and say, it is your fault that Africa is not moving forward. And leaving behind our responsibility, the West's responsibility, and their part in creating the architecture that we're seeing in Africa today. So that's why when we speak about Africa and the political dispensation and conflicts, we cannot speak about it without speaking about the role that those of us that are pointing fingers have in creating the situation that we see today. In Parliament, we talk about, one of the things we talk about is the environment. In Europe, on the rest of the world, globally, we talk about the environment. We have goals that we need to reach. And I'll give you an example, a country like Congo. A country like Congo, where first of all it started, where Leopold, King Leopold from Belgium, took over this country as his own. Killed 10 million black people. Some people will walk to death to enrich Europe. You know, rubber, the tires that you used for your cars. And yet, until today, there is conflict in Congo. It's the longest existing conflict in the world where so many people are killed and yet we don't talk about it. We wonder why the democratic dispensation in Africa is the way it is. But we know why. We just don't want to talk about why. We would like to shift the blame and put it on the people in Congo, the people in Africa. Why can't they stop the war? Yeah, there's a reason why they cannot stop the war. There's a reason because there is a capitalistic system that is based on exploitation. We talk about the environment, we say we need to reduce the emissions. And one of the things in Sweden and the rest of Europe, what we talk about is we need to get cars, electric cars. They're good. But one thing we forget to talk about is the electric cars need electric batteries. And these electric batteries need coltan, which is a mineral that do not exist in Europe. It exists in Africa. So we have our companies that will go to this place, and they would have mines that they would own for 100 years, and they would employ children as young as 7 years old to go into these mines without any form of protection, to get these minerals so that we can enrich ourselves in the West. And yet we wonder why there is absolute poverty in Africa and why there are conflicts in Africa. But we don't talk about what we still are doing. I'm not talking about historically what we've been doing, but what we contemporarily continue to do. That contributes immensely to the poverty and the democratic dispensation and the conflicts that we see in Africa today. So we must speak about those issues. And being somebody that of African descent and living in Europe, having the platform that I have in Parliament, I get to speak about those issues. And it makes people uncomfortable. Now, Gambia is not an exception because Gambia was one of the point of departure when it comes to enslavement. You know, there was a time, and this is a painful history because if you look at our history and you know in 1884, all the boundaries that we see today, artificial boundaries that we did not in any way, shape or form contribute in creating. It was the West that met in Berlin that decided to demarcate Africa the way it looks like today. And we hate each other because I'm Gambian, he's Senegalese. But what we don't know is that the boundaries that were made between Gambia and Senegal, we did not contribute in creating them. But it is the West that forced, they imposed those boundaries upon us. And yet today, we hate each other because of those boundaries. We need to talk about the causes and not the effects. We talk about the effects, we talk about the consequences, we talk about how people hate each other, we talk about the Mandinkas and the Fulas and the Jolas and all this. Yes, they are important issues. And we talk about them, and enough people talk about them, and we should talk about them. But I don't think there are enough people speaking about why we ended up where we are today in Africa. And that, for me, is also important and significant for us to speak about. When we talk about the multi-party system, and we talk about democracy and democratic dispensation, quite often, yesterday we had a conversation at one of the brothers' houses, and the wife said, why do we always measure up Africa's democracy and democratic dispensation to the West? Why do we always say, oh, Gambia is like that and that and that? That would never happen in Norway. There's no way under democratic dispensation. Is that the ambition that we have? Is that the best? Is that how it's supposed to look? We say that because most of us don't know the real democratic dispensation in Norway. Most of us don't know the real democratic dispensation in Sweden. We don't know that in Sweden we sell weapons to African nations that are in conflict. We don't know that Sweden have companies that are in Congo that are mining and employing children and paying them less than 5 kronas a day. Is that the kind of democracy that we look up to? Is that what we want? We see what they present to us. So that's why Africa needs to have its own democracy. When we have a multi-party system, we were talking about in Gambia, every day you have new parties that want to come up. And I said, that's a good thing. We need to have democracy that works for Africa. Now, if it means having multi-party system, 20, 30 political parties, that would trigger some kind of engagement. It would trigger conversation, political conversation at national level. And that is good because it enlightens people. We start talking about issues affecting us rather than talking about issues that are not that are out of our control. We start talking about people living in the Gambia, their living conditions. We start talking about jobs in the Gambia. But when we start looking up to other countries, the West especially, that we quite often do, you know, where I come from in Gambia, when I grew up, whilst I grew up, when you speak good English, you're called a white person. When you dressed nice, you're called a white person. When you have intellectual capacities, you are called a white person. When you're clean, you're called a white person. If you go to a city and the city is beautiful, they say, this doesn't look like an African city. If you buy clothes that are made in Gambia, they say, no, this is Africa. I want to buy something that comes from Europe. So everything beautiful, everything good has to come from the West. And that needs to change. The mentality. And to sum up, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Because when I went to Gambia this year and last year, and I met young people, they speak just like I'm speaking today. They are aware of who they are, they're proud of who they are, they're aware of their history, they are proud of their history, and they're ready to create change, and they do not apologize anybody for that. And that gives me hope that the Africa that we see coming in the next generation would be an Africa for Africans that is developed by Africans in the African way. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you very much, Mr. Jallo.
Thank you.
That was a blockbuster of a speech, and you've pretty much identified the hypocrisy that exists globally, and that the issues that we need to talk about, have dialogue, see how we can improve those issues that still linger and affect Africa per se. I think this is going to be a very interesting, I don't know if you guys have questions for each other. Maybe we can start off from that end. I know I have a few questions, but any of you have questions for any of the panelists?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, I will raise two questions. First from our brother, Jallo. Looking at the problem, the core problem, you have mentioned the contribution from colonialism. I've talked about the efforts that were being made to shape the continent. What do you see to be the relationship between the external and internal factor? From my own perspective, we see the external contribution, but the internal condition is always the basis of change. And the external factor only contribute, either negatively or positively. So don't you think that the real challenge to transform the continent and countries is internal, and that the real solution is building the minds of people so that they become real thinkers, to know nature and society, know the reality they are confronting, and to move on, and that the external factor will be forced to complement, to cope with the internal changes. What's your opinion on that?
I totally agree. I concur to what you're saying. I think both factors are required. I think it's important that we are aware, we look to the past and know our history and know the contributions to the situations, contributions to that created the situation that we find ourselves here in Africa today. But Africa can only change when Africans themselves create the change that they want to see. I'm very aware of that. And as I mentioned, the young Africans that I see today are Africans that do not apologize for their existence, that are Africans that have built up their minds in a way that we need to see the change that we want to see. But you said something initially. You said where there is oppression, there will be resistance, and when there is persistence and resistance, there will be change. Now, we've seen that. We've seen that there has been oppression in Gambia, and that built up resistance, and that resistance is creating change. Now, the change it has created now is not systematic change, but with persistence, I'm quite sure and I'm quite confident there will be systematic change. And you personally and your organization and your political party has been contributing immensely in building up the minds of people and their mindset, changing it to prepare them for this change, systematical change that we are looking for. And I'm quite sure that's going to happen. The reason why, and like I said, I want to emphasize, I agree with you 100%, but the reason why I'm mentioning the external factors is that this is not only historically, it's today. When you're trying to create change in Africa today, you have the capitalists in Africa today that would do everything. We've seen people like Nkrumah, we've seen Thomas Sankara, who's an exceptional example, who came in and said, we want to create change. We've seen poverty, we want to change that. We want to be able to be self-sufficient. We want to be able to have enough food to be able to even export. We want to be able to make sure there is gender equity in this country. We want to be able to make sure that we are not dependent to the West. But what happened? The West said, that's not a good example that we want to be spread in Africa. We don't want that systemic change. We get rid of him. We've seen so many other leaders that try to do that, and they've been eliminated. They've been, Gaddafi is one of the last persons who was talking about African unity, and we saw what happened to him. And we see now what happened in Libya. Black people are enslaved, sold. So we need to, as we talk about empowering Africans in Africa, changing their mindset, we need to be very much aware of there is a system of power, a global system of power that is based on capitalism, that is doing everything possible for Africa not to be able to achieve its potential and punch its weight. And that's something we need to work on and try to see what we can do to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tuna, you have something to add on to that?
No, not apart from the fact that I agree with the analysis that the causes are very much external, but of course that the sources of change come from within. But also I would say that many of these processes get their own dynamic, so that they can be, I mean, like the example of tribalist rhetoric under Jammeh that echoed colonial structures in a way. And I'm a bit also, I'm concerned with one issue that Khalifa Salah mentioned relating to oppression and context of oppression that I found very interesting, and the issue of the mob. Because I'm wondering what, one source of oppression, for instance, and potential source of oppression coming from the mob that seem to lead very many processes of ethnic incorporation on the African continent. And there seems to be a fine balance. On the one hand, you want to let youth express their opinions, but on the other hand, it seems that some of the extremists in the current debate come from youth. So how do you, allow people to express their political opinions, but at the same time not fall victim of mob justice? That's perhaps a question I would direct back to both of you.
Yes, I think that is a very key issue, because one is the emotive issue, to hate oppression. But if that is not guided, then it just becomes anger and frustration and reaction, which becomes senseless violence. Attacking on people who have not done anything to you. Because you have to question, why would somebody put on an explosive belt, go in the middle of a market in Nigeria, and just blow oneself up? What mindset, what development, what orientation? And that's why I emphasize the issue of the power of belief. Because if the person unreasonably believes in a personality and will do whatever the personality say unquestioningly, well, obviously you will have that type of a reaction. So my emphasis is that there is a stage of development we need to reach. And I conceive that to be the final stage of the democratic phase. It will require building institutions. It will require also acculturation, building the human person to know that one owns society and one deserves liberty and prosperity from society, and that one needs to make a choice of leaders, and one should know which leaders to choose. That is a process of growth, because it's not an individual decision, it's the decision of a people. So it means that the person must at each time be oneself, but also a social being belonging to a people. Now this whole subject of belonging to a people has not really been addressed in our political evolution. It is now that the challenge by parties, etc., but at the national level, And that's why the importance. Yes, Obama said Africa does not need strong leaders, need strong institutions. Well, you know, those are things that you just simply say. They have no meaning, really, with all due respect. Because you really need leaders who will guide policies, who will guide development of laws, who will guide the whole process of what type of programs you're going to have in order to attain the economic emancipation you need. This does not come from the sky. It comes from study. It comes from knowledge. You must know how things are done. So really, my answer there is, yes, we need to give strength to the person and the sense of self-ownership. But then it must be guided by maturity, by capacity to understand what is in the best interest of self and in the society as a whole. And once that happens, then the emotive issue disappears and reason will guide, emotions, and obviously the end result is achieving what you desire to achieve. Because ultimately we must see that, yes, there is an Africa, but there is a world. And that's why the whole globalization conference is so significant, that there is the possibility of a new world where people can relate on the basis of equality and mutual interest. There is the possibility of building a world where nations or countries can relate on the basis of mutual interest. That is there. As it rightly said, we need to articulate that world. We need to believe in that world and need to work together to really shape that world. And I believe that that is the essence of such conferences, that at least we have the gut feeling, know exactly what is wrong and what he is reflecting now, especially as this migration issue comes. And I think that your globalization conference must capture this, because there is exclusion, that, well, you are no longer wanted. Then you go back to a continent where all the wealth is there, the diamonds is there, the oil is there, then you start to question the leadership. Hey, we cannot fit there, but now we are here. And what we are here also, it is companies who own this thing and taking it back, so we are creating an explosive world, and we are doing so unreasoningly. Some of us do not want to really perpetuate that, because it's like you are agitating. Because when it happens, it appears you created by agitation. So therefore, our leadership style means that, yes, we do not play into things, but there is a latent division of the world, which ultimately can be very explosive and counterproductive to the world. And when that happens, you're talking about a new generation of rebellions, of conflict, whose ultimate consequences no one dares to think about at the moment. But we must think about and we must prevent. And the prevention is really knowing that really all these people do not need to be coming from the continent to go outside, but they are yet to have the responsible leadership that will utilize their resources so that they can have a space and place in their own countries.
Well, informed decision can lead to... Informed decision as a precondition can lead to electing good leadership. Well, America didn't do that justice, but we'll leave that for another discussion. But is there anybody on the floor that has any question for these?
You had a question?
Thank you. I didn't really prepare to ask you, but I think your injection was extremely to the point that we have, the history of Africa seems to be one of exploiting, and we have done that for hundreds of years. We can't. It's in our genes, as we say. But you look at, one can change the genes and one can change our character, and we probably have to work hard on that, because I agree with you about Berlin. It was not the last time they just took whatever they wanted and divided and so on. So you know your history better than I, but I'm very grateful for your injection that we cannot all the time say, oh, Africans and so on, and we are still. I have been learning developing countries' economy, and the lecturer in Denmark said, well, African trade with Africa doesn't matter, is unimportant in Danish economy. Well, I thought that's very queer. In reality, it was some 20 years ago when I heard that, when I started. But afterwards, really realizing that we pay a few pennies for whatever we take over, and when people want to buy anything, cornflakes or whatever from Denmark or meat, well, they have to pay so high prices. So it makes no difference in my calculation if I pay so little for things and I take so high prices, as far as I understand the economy, the way we are running. If I may add a question is, I mean, Africa has been so subjected to European, rule for many years. I wonder, how do you see the influence in Africa of Chinese and Eastern powers? I would like to ask you. Thank you.
Two things that you've mentioned. I do not agree that exploitation is in genes. I think it's a reality, and it must be contextualized. And not all people are exploiters. There are people who own the means of production and utilize it to exploit other people. Now, second dimension, we want to emphasize that there is always a reaction to oppression. I remember in the United States, when black people were being called monkeys, etc., then the Black Power movement came. I am black and proud. That's a resistance. Is putting in a sense of dignity and self-worth in the person. Of course, it becomes a movement, a reaction that you cannot humiliate me, you cannot turn me into somebody who is undignified. I remember discussing with, in the ACP EU Parliament, they were talking about racism. And it was like, well, people really should have sympathy. I said, wait a minute. What do you mean by racism? Because I have to understand the concept in the first place. I said, is there anybody in this hall who is not a human being? So all of us accepted that we were human beings. So there is only a human race. So I told them that if I look at you, I know you're a human being, but I say you are not a human being, then who is ill? The person who looks at reality and distorts reality, that is the person who is ill. That is the person who needs sympathy. Secondly, if I move from the angle of not only saying that you are not a human being, I hate you and try to destroy you, that's psychosis. That's somebody whose illness is increasing. That is a threat to society. That person needs help from psychiatrists. And I'm serious. So in essence, when I said that, everybody agreed that that is the reality. And they said, well, then we are beginning to have a sick society. I said, if the vast majority of people think in that way, operate at that psychosis level, then that society is sick. And we all accepted that we need to do something about the concept itself. That's what I mean. That the situation is that we need greater understanding among human beings. And lastly, whether China or any country is interest that permeates international relations. And still, we do not have African leaders that are capable of taking charge of the continent. That is the problem we are experiencing. We must understand that. Yeah. But undoubtedly, China must be seen in its proper context. That China is importing raw materials and exporting manufactured goods. So this paradigm that because China was a country that was colonized before and went through the same experience, and as a result is going to shape a new international order is a myth. What must be understood is that anybody who wants the African continent to develop we must build up these three elements. We must assist the continent to be able to use it, process its raw materials, and to build the machines that will do the processing. That is the only way that the continent can be economically emancipated. And whether China or any country that fails to help Africa achieve that, we are just engaged still in the regime of being a third world country dominated by others.
Yes, I'm going to talk about China. First of all, I'm not sure if I agree with the Honorable when it comes to the racism thing, because I think racism, I don't see it as a sickness, but I see it as a matter of power and privileges. Now, people use their power against others, and they dominate others, and they use hate, and they do it calculatedly. They know, I'm going to do this because I have a privileged position, and I'm going to make sure that privileged position is maintained by all means necessary. But we don't have to go into the discussion now. What I want to talk about when it comes to China, whether China or not, and I agree with the Honorable, whether it's China or the United States or Europe that comes to Africa and exploits Africa, one thing that needs to be in place is that Africans themselves must articulate, it has to be mutual. Now China, they articulated what their people want. They know what their people want and they're pursuing it. That's good leadership. We need to articulate what our people want, and we pursue it so it's mutual. But today, China will come to Africa. They will bring Chinese people and employ them in Africa instead of employing our people. They would not train our people to learn the trades and the engineering that is needed. Trains that are built in Africa, the train drivers are Chinese instead of Africans and Kenyans. That needs to change. But the reason why that is happening is because our African leaders fail to articulate the part, when we say mutual, the part that benefits Africans themselves rather than the Chinese. The Chinese are very good at it. We are not so good at it. That needs to change. That needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Malcolm. I think that was a brilliant way of just wrapping this up. I just got word that we're running out of time. I pretty much must wrap it up. So I think it's fair for everybody to just give a last remarks on the subject matter. Mr. Salah.
Well, I believe a new world is possible. A new world where human beings become thinkers, inventors, and builders of a civilization that is inclusive. That citizenship must not be based on color, on gender, on regional origin. It must be based on statehood. And where there are citizens who understand that collectively they own a state and that they should work together to ensure their collective survival, liberty and prosperity, we will have a new country. And if that permeates the whole world, we'll have a new world. And that should be the destiny of humankind. Never in history has a people just decided to commit genocide. And without the state providing the services that people need in our continent, there will be a lot of stateless people living in states. Because whenever the state does not serve you, in a way you are stateless. And this is what gives rise to all these issues that we talk about, terrorism, etc. But from early childhood, if the state take care of that child, nurture that child, provide for that child fits into the division of labor of society and becomes a productive adult, there is no gap in the life of that person to become somebody else. So that is our challenge, and I believe that challenge will lead us to build a new country and a new world that will serve all of us. My last comment is, yes, many leaders have tried, and we should acknowledge their contributions, but we'll also acknowledge their limitations. What has happened, the intervention in Libya has not created any development in Libya. It has created statelessness, and people must accept responsibility. But we must also bear in mind that the level Gaddafi was the level of wanting to be a king of Africa. This is not the era of monarchy. And he has really displayed those tendencies at the final phase of his rule. Really, Africa is moving towards the sovereignty of people. And we need a leadership that will be able to enlighten the people so that they become sovereign. We are not really looking for heroes anymore to guide us. We're looking for leaders, genuine leaders, real thinkers to guide us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salah. Leaders, that's what Africans need.
I think I will say amen to that talk by Khalifa Salah, and simply express that I wish we would have had the time to, especially with reference to the Gambia, to have discussed issues of reconciliation. How do we include in democratic participation those who passively sympathized with former oppressors, which is a huge issue, I believe, in not only Gambia but across the continent. But I'll let that linger, and perhaps that can be another topic for discussion.
Yes, most definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuna.
I'm just going to keep it very short and just say I agree 100% with Honorable Khalifa Salah's conclusion. And I would just leave you with his own words, that where there is oppression, there is resistance. And when there is persistence and resistance, there will be change. And I'm quite sure with the new generation of Africans, we'll be seeing change quite soon. Thank you so much.
On that note,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanking everybody for turning up.